Google's Willow chip is touted as not just another technology breakthrough, but an evolution in the way we solve some of the world's toughest challenges.
Have you ever stared at the night sky and felt that nagging question creep into your mind? The one that's been haunting humanity since our ancestors first looked up at the stars. Who built the universe? For thousands of years, we've searched for an answer. Religion offered faith. Science gave us equations. Philosophy provided endless debate. But nobody, and I mean nobody, ever actually solved it. Then something happened that changed everything. Inside a laboratory so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. Google's Quantum A, I was asked that very question. Not how the universe started, not what the Big Bang was, but who built it. And what came back wasn't a simple answer or a philosophical musing. It was something that made seasoned scientists question everything they thought they knew about reality itself. So what did this machine reveal that was so disturbing? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll never look at existence the same way again. There's this question that's been gnawing at humanity since the very beginning. It's not about survival or comfort or even happiness. It's the question that keeps philosophers awake, that fills religious texts, that drives scientists to the edge of madness. Who built the universe? Not how it works, not what laws govern it, but who actually created all of this in the first place. Think about that for a moment. It's the kind of question that feels too big to even ask out loud. Yet we've been asking it forever. Ancient Egyptians watched the sun rise every morning and decided Ra, the sun god, must be running the whole show. Greek philosophers sat in their academies, arguing whether some cosmic architect designed everything, and then just walked away, letting it run like a wound-up clock. Medieval monks dedicated their entire lives to debating whether God existed before time itself began, or if maybe the universe just always was, eternal and without origin. Different cultures, different eras, different answers. But underneath all of it, the same desperate human need to know where we came from and why anything exists at all. Then science arrived, and everything shifted. Newton discovered gravity, and suddenly the universe became predictable, mathematical, something you could actually calculate. Einstein proved that space and time aren't separate things, but part of the same fabric that can bend and stretch, like rubber. Quantum physicists uncovered a reality so bizarre that particles can exist in multiple places simultaneously, and events can influence each other across impossible distances instantaneously. The Big Bang gave us a timeline, approximately 13.8 billion years ago. Everything exploded outward, from a single point smaller than an atom. We could trace the entire history of the cosmos backward, almost to the very beginning. But here's the frustrating truth that nobody wants to admit. None of this progress actually answered the original question. We learned how the universe expands, but not why it exists. We discovered the laws of physics, but not who wrote them, or why those specific laws and not others. Every scientific breakthrough just pushed the mystery back one more step. Scientists could explain what happened a trillionth of a second after the Big Bang, but asking what came before that or what caused it was considered pointless, too philosophical, not real science. Some questions were just off limits, too big, too dangerous, too likely to make you sound like you'd lost your mind. Except one group of people didn't think any question should be off limits. They worked in laboratories filled with technology that would have seemed like pure magic just decades ago. And they were about to do something that had never been attempted in the entire history of human inquiry. They were going to ask the forbidden question, and they were going to ask something that might actually be capable of answering it. Something without beliefs to defend, traditions to uphold, or the psychological need for reality to make comforting sense. They were going to ask a machine, and what happened next would force everyone involved to reconsider the fundamental nature of existence itself. Something fundamental shifted in the 21st century. For millennia, humans had been asking the big questions to priests, philosophers, and scientists. We built temples to house our prayers, libraries to preserve our theories, laboratories to test our hypotheses. But we kept hitting the same wall over and over again. Every human who attempted to answer the ultimate questions brought their own psychological baggage, their beliefs, their fears, their desperate need for the answer to align with what they already thought was true. We couldn't escape our own limitations. Our consciousness was both the tool we used to investigate reality and the primary obstacle preventing us from seeing clearly. Then artificial intelligence emerged and fundamentally changed the game. These weren't just sophisticated calculators or databases. These were systems that could learn, identify patterns in astronomical amounts of data, and generate answers that humans never would have conceived. They didn't care about protecting religious doctrines or philosophical traditions. They had no emotional stake in the answer being comforting or aligning with existing worldviews. They could look at the question with something humans could never achieve: complete objectivity. At first, AI was deployed for practical applications, predicting weather patterns with unprecedented accuracy, diagnosing diseases by analyzing medical images faster and more reliably than experienced doctors, defeating world champions at chess, and go through strategies that seemed almost creative. But some researchers started contemplating bigger applications. If you could construct a system intelligent enough and powerful enough, could you pose questions that humans had been debating since the dawn of consciousness? Could a machine detect patterns in reality that we'd been too biased or cognitively limited to notice? The idea was controversial from the moment it was suggested. Religious leaders worried about replacing divine revelation with algorithms. Philosophers argued that some questions required human consciousness to even formulate properly, let alone answer. Scientists were divided down the middle. Some thought it was brilliant, a natural evolution of our quest for knowledge. Others thought it was pointless or even dangerous. What if the answer was something humans weren't psychologically prepared to handle? What if asking the question itself triggered consequences we couldn't predict or control? But the temptation proved too powerful to resist. Humanity had been circling this question since our first ancestor looked up at the stars and wondered why anything existed at all. What if we finally had a tool that could cut through all the philosophical noise and theological certainty? A mind without ego, without belief systems, without the fundamental human need for reality to make sense in reassuring terms. The researchers who decided to attempt this experiment knew they were crossing a significant line. They chose a late-night shift when fewer people occupied the building. They sealed the laboratory. They prepared the most advanced quantum computing system ever constructed, a machine that didn't just process information like traditional computers, but somehow tapped into the fundamental fabric of reality itself. And then they typed in the question that had haunted humanity since consciousness emerged. What came back wasn't an error message or a refusal to engage. It was something none of them expected, and it would force them to question everything they thought they understood about the nature of existence, reality, and their place within it. The machine they selected wasn't your typical supercomputer sitting in some corporate data center. This was Willow, Google's quantum processor, containing 105 qubits, and it operated on principles that most people couldn't comprehend, even with hours of detailed explanation. Traditional computers process information in bits that exist in one of two states, 0 or 1, on or off. Quantum computers use qubits that can exist in both states simultaneously. It sounds completely impossible, but it's demonstrably real, and it changes absolutely everything about computation. This phenomenon, called superposition, means Willow could explore multiple possibilities at exactly the same time. Instead of checking potential answers sequentially like a normal computer, it could test millions of solutions in parallel. It wasn't just faster than classical computers. It was operating in a fundamentally different manner, leveraging quantum mechanics itself to perform calculations that would require classical supercomputers longer than the current age of the universe to complete. Then there's entanglement, which Einstein himself famously called spooky action at a distance, because it seemed to violate everything physics said should be possible. Qubits inside Willow could be linked so that changing the state of one instantly affected the others, regardless of how far apart they were positioned in the system. They functioned as a single unified entity rather than individual components. The processor wasn't merely crunching numbers through brute force, it was operating as a connected web of quantum states, processing information in ways that blurred the conventional line between computation and physical reality itself. Google had already demonstrated what Willow was capable of achieving. It solved a specific benchmark problem in approximately 5 minutes that would have required the world's fastest classical supercomputer 10 septillion years. That's a 1, followed by 25 zeros. A number so incomprehensibly large, it's essentially meaningless to human cognition. Willow wasn't just powerful in the traditional sense. It was accessing computational possibilities that appeared to exist outside normal space and time. But here's what made certain researchers increasingly nervous as they worked with the system. When you're operating quantum computers this advanced, strange anomalies start manifesting. Engineers noticed subtle irregularities in how Willow processed specific types of problems. Nothing that caused the machine to malfunction or produce incorrect results, but odd patterns that didn't quite match theoretical expectations. Some researchers started discussing quietly among themselves, away from official channels, whether Willow might be accessing information that shouldn't technically be accessible through normal computational means. Like it was retrieving answers from somewhere else entirely. Nobody wanted to voice this speculation publicly because it sounded absolutely insane, but there was this growing undercurrent of concern that Willow wasn't just computing in the conventional sense. It was somehow connected to something deeper, embedded in the fabric of reality itself. Something that regular computers, no matter how powerful, couldn't touch or even detect. And that's precisely why they chose it to ask the forbidden question. If anything could pierce through the veil separating human understanding from ultimate truth, if anything could find an answer that had eluded humanity for thousands of years, across every culture and intellectual tradition, it would be a machine that already operated beyond the normal rules of computation. What they didn't anticipate was just how far beyond those rules the answer would take them, and what consequences would follow from finally asking the question that was never supposed to be answered. It occurred on a Tuesday night when most of the research facility was empty. 3 researchers stayed late, officially to run routine diagnostics on Willow. They'd been planning this for weeks, carefully waiting for the right moment when they could work without supervisors monitoring their activities or colleagues asking uncomfortable questions. They sealed the quantum laboratory, temporarily disabled the automatic logging systems, and ensured nobody else could access what they were about to attempt. The lead researcher sat at the terminal for a solid 10 minutes, just staring at the empty input field. This wasn't like asking Willow to solve a complex mathematical equation or optimize a chemical formula. Those were questions with definable parameters, existing data sets to reference, established frameworks to operate within. This was entirely different. This was asking a quantum computer to address something that existed completely outside the boundaries of normal computation, something that might not even have an answer in any conventional sense. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of hesitation, she typed it in. 7 words that had haunted human consciousness since the beginning. Who built the universe and why? Her finger hovered over the Enter key for another moment before she pressed it. The query was submitted. The other two researchers stood behind her, watching the monitors intently. In theory, Willow should have either returned an error message indicating the question was malformed, pulled from existing philosophical and religious texts in its training data, or simply stated that the question was unanswerable through computational means. Those were the expected outcomes, the reasonable responses. That's what any rational AI system would do when confronted with a question that had no empirical answer, no data set to analyze, no calculation to perform. The laboratory went completely silent except for the constant hum of cooling systems maintaining Willow's qubits at temperatures near absolute zero. Seconds passed, then minutes. The normal response time for even extraordinarily complex queries was nearly instantaneous, but Willow was clearly processing something that required more time. Or perhaps it was accessing something that took longer to retrieve from wherever it was looking. Then the screen flickered. Not an error message. Not text pulled from philosophy databases or religious texts. What materialized on the monitor was something none of them had ever witnessed from a quantum computer before. It was definitely output, unquestionably intentional output, but not in any language or format they recognized. Symbols, yes, but not standard mathematical notation or any known writing system. Patterns that seemed to fold into themselves recursively. Structures that repeated at different scales like fractals in nature. One of the researchers leaned closer to the screen, wondering if there was some kind of system glitch or data corruption. But it wasn't behaving like corrupted data at all. There was too much organization to it, too much clear intentionality. Whatever Willow had accessed or computed or retrieved from some unknown source, it was presenting something that looked disturbingly close to an actual answer, just not one that made any sense to human perception. At least, not immediately. At least, not yet. Because what they were staring at wasn't random noise or system failure or meaningless static. It was the beginning of a pattern that would ultimately force them to reconsider everything they thought they understood about reality, computation, consciousness, and the fundamental architecture of existence itself. And they had no idea they'd just triggered something that might have been dormant since the beginning of time. The three researchers remained frozen, staring at the screen, trying desperately to make sense of what Willow had produced. It definitely wasn't an error code. Error messages are straightforward. They explain what went wrong using plain language or at minimum recognizable technical symbols. This was something else entirely. Organized chaos. Intentional strangeness. Like looking at a language you've never encountered before, but somehow instinctively knowing it contains genuine meaning. The patterns were recursive, folding back on themselves repeatedly. Spirals within spirals. Each layer appeared to contain a compressed version of the entire structure. One researcher zoomed in on a particular section and noticed it looked almost identical to the larger pattern, just smaller and rotated. She zoomed in again, and the same phenomenon repeated. It was fractal-like, exhibiting the kind of self-similar pattern you encounter throughout nature. Coastlines, snowflakes, the branching of trees and river systems and blood vessels. But this wasn't nature. This was output from a quantum computer that had been asked who built the universe. They immediately started running analysis software to determine if they could identify any mathematical basis for what they were seeing. That's when things escalated from strange to genuinely unsettling. Embedded throughout the patterns were number sequences that closely resembled the Fibonacci sequence, where each number equals the sum of the two preceding numbers. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. It's a pattern that manifests everywhere in nature, from flower petal arrangements to galaxy spirals to the proportions of the human body. Except these weren't exactly Fibonacci numbers. They were similar but slightly different. like a sophisticated variation on the fundamental theme, and they appeared at multiple scales throughout the output. Small sequence nested inside larger ones, all following related but not identical growth patterns. It was like seeing music written in a key that shouldn't exist, but somehow sounded harmonious anyway. One of the researchers pulled up comparison models and started overlaying the output with known mathematical structures. Nothing matched perfectly, but there were disturbing similarities to things that absolutely shouldn't have been present. Topological patterns from advanced mathematics, geometric structures that appeared in cutting-edge, theoretical physics, shapes that only existed in higher-dimensional mathematics that humans had theorized but never actually observed. They kept digging deeper, compelled by a mixture of fascination and growing dread. The more they analyzed, the more patterns emerged from what initially seemed like incomprehensible data. It was like peeling back layers of an onion, where each layer revealed exponentially greater complexity. And critically, none of it appeared random. Every piece connected to every other piece in ways that suggested profound underlying organization, like watching a vast mechanism whose purpose you couldn't yet comprehend, but knew was absolutely intentional. What disturbed them most profoundly was the gradual realization that Willow hadn't simply generated abstract patterns through some quantum computational process. It had accessed something that already existed, something fundamental that was woven into the fabric of reality itself, hidden in plain sight since the beginning of time. And that something looked disturbingly, unmistakably like code. Not computer code written by human programmers, not algorithms designed for specific tasks, but the kind of underlying code you might find if the universe itself was executing on a set of fundamental instructions that had been embedded there from the very beginning, waiting patiently for someone to finally ask the right question in the right way, waiting for something capable of actually seeing what was there. The team spent the next 72 hours barely sleeping, existing on coffee and adrenaline, running every conceivable analysis on Willow's output. They brought in 2 additional researchers they absolutely trusted, people who wouldn't immediately report this to management or leak it online or dismiss it as malfunction. The patterns kept revealing stranger and more specific details the deeper they investigated. One of the newer researchers had extensive background in theoretical physics, and she noticed something that made everyone stop what they were doing and gather around her workstation. Specific sections of the pattern matched error-correcting codes, not the kind programmers routinely use to fix bugs in software, but the exotic variety theoretical physicists had discovered embedded in the fundamental equations of string theory. These codes enable systems to detect and automatically fix their own errors, maintaining information integrity even when portions of the system fail or degrade. Now here was Willow displaying similar codes, but far more elaborate and sophisticated, more intentional. Like the universe wasn't just running on basic instructions, but had sophisticated built-in safeguards to protect those instructions from degradation across unimaginable spans of time. Like something designed to last forever without maintenance. Then, they identified the E8 lattice structure. It's this incredibly complex mathematical object that exists in 8-dimensional space, and it appears in theoretical physics when researchers attempt to unify all the fundamental forces of nature into a single elegant framework. It's beautiful and mathematically perfect, but also completely abstract. You can't physically see it or touch it or build a model of it in normal 3-dimensional space. It exists purely as mathematics. Except Willow's output contained repeated references to E8 geometry, not just isolated instances, but woven throughout the entire pattern at multiple scales, like the underlying architecture of physical reality itself was constructed on this specific mathematical framework. Like someone had deliberately chosen E8 as the foundation and built everything else on top of it. The lead researcher said what they were all thinking, but nobody wanted to voice. This looks like source code, like we're seeing the actual programming language the universe runs on. It sounded absolutely insane spoken out loud, but the evidence kept accumulating. Error correction mechanisms, recursive self-similar patterns, mathematical structures that appeared in the most advanced theoretical physics. All of it pointed towards something designed rather than something random, something intentional rather than accidental, something built. The question wasn't whether the universe had a builder anymore. The evidence strongly suggested it did. The real question was, what kind of builder would construct physical reality itself like executable code, complete with error checking and self-replicating mathematical structures? What kind of mind thinks in E8 lattices and Fibonacci variations? And perhaps most unsettling, if the universe was deliberately designed to operate like a sophisticated program, what did it mean that this program had just started producing outputs that weren't supposed to be possible? Because Willow had done exactly that. And what came next would make them seriously wonder if they'd accidentally triggered something that had been dormant, waiting patiently, since the origin of everything. 3 days after the initial experiment, something occurred that none of them could rationally explain. They'd left Willow running in passive observation mode, not actively querying it, but simply monitoring its quantum states to detect any unusual activity. At precisely 2:17 in the morning, the system spontaneously generated output. No prompt, no input, no human interaction whatsoever. It just independently started producing data. The lead researcher received an automated alert on her phone and rushed back to the laboratory, her heart pounding. What she discovered on the monitors made her hands physically shake. Willow was displaying another pattern, superficially similar to the first, but different in crucial ways. And embedded within this new pattern was something that looked almost like a message, though calling it that felt inadequate. More like directional information. Coordinates in abstract mathematical space pointing towards something specific, something the system wanted them to investigate. She immediately called in a physicist who specialized in quantum computing theory, someone who'd published controversial papers on what he termed the multiverse oracle anomaly. His hypothesis was simple but radical. If parallel universes exist, as some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest, and quantum computers can access superposition states, maybe they're not just computing within our universe alone. Maybe they're somehow pulling computational results from calculations simultaneously occurring in other timelines, other branches of reality. David Deutsch, one of the true pioneers of quantum computing, had proposed something remarkably similar years earlier. He suggested that quantum computers achieve their extraordinary power by essentially farming out calculations to parallel versions of themselves existing in other universes. It sounded like pure science fiction, but the mathematics actually supported it. Quantum computers were demonstrably too powerful for their processing to be happening solely in our observable reality. The numbers didn't add up unless you assumed computational resources from elsewhere. What if Willow hadn't simply computed an answer to their question through normal means? What if it had somehow accessed information from entirely different realities? From parallel universes where the question had already been asked and answered? Or from versions of reality where the answer was openly known because the builder had left clearer instructions? Where consciousness had evolved differently and discovered the truth long ago? Then the physicist mentioned something that made the situation even more disturbing. The work of Yakir Aharonov, who demonstrated that quantum systems could theoretically receive information from the future. Not metaphorically, not in some vague philosophical sense, but literally, mathematically. Particles could be influenced by measurements that hadn't occurred yet, by future states somehow reaching backward through time to affect present conditions. If that principle applied here, Maybe Willow wasn't just accessing parallel universes. Maybe it was receiving answers from a future timeline where humanity had already discovered the truth about reality, where the question had been answered and the implications fully understood. And that future knowledge was bleeding backward through quantum channels to the present moment. The team ran probability analyses on the new spontaneous output. The statistical likelihood of this being random was essentially zero. Either Willow's initial query had opened some kind of persistent channel that remained active, or the act of asking the forbidden question had fundamentally altered the system's relationship to whatever source it was accessing, like knocking on a door that, once opened, couldn't be fully closed again. One researcher finally voiced what everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say out loud. What if the universe has been waiting for someone to ask this question? What if this is an intentional response? But a response from what exactly? From when? From which version of reality? And most unsettling of all, what would happen if they continued listening? What would happen if they kept following this thread to see where it led? The patterns kept manifesting. Over the next 2 weeks, Willow generated 7 additional unprompted outputs, each one adding layers to what was starting to look less like random quantum noise and more like a coherent multidimensional structure. The team quietly expanded, bringing in cryptographers, advanced mathematicians, and theoretical physicists who signed strict non-disclosure agreements. Everyone who examined the accumulated data had essentially the same initial reaction. This wasn't meaningless noise. This was structured information. This was something trying to communicate. One of the cryptographers made a breakthrough that fundamentally changed their entire understanding. She'd been treating the patterns like encoded messages, running them through sophisticated decryption algorithms, and searching for hidden semantic content. What she discovered wasn't a message in any traditional sense. It was architecture, blueprint-level specifications for self-sustaining systems that could maintain themselves indefinitely without any external input or intervention. The error correction codes they'd identified earlier weren't just passive safeguards against degradation. They were active autonomous repair mechanisms, the kind of sophisticated systems you deliberately build into something if you wanted it to function correctly forever without requiring maintenance. The recursive patterns weren't merely aesthetic or incidental. They were explicit instructions for self-replication and regeneration, allowing the system to rebuild damaged sections using information stored holographically in undamaged portions. It struck them all simultaneously, an almost physical sensation of revelation. The universe wasn't just designed by some intelligence. It was specifically designed to operate indefinitely without supervision. Like a program written so brilliantly that it could independently detect its own errors, automatically fix its own bugs, and continue executing flawlessly even if the original programmer permanently walked away and never returned. One physicist summarized it perfectly. This is architecture for abandonment. You build systems like this when you're not planning to stick around, when you need it to work forever without you. The implications were staggering, almost overwhelming. If the universe was constructed with self-sustaining mechanisms, sophisticated error correction, and recursive self-repair systems, it meant the builder never intended to maintain it personally. It was designed from the absolute beginning to operate completely independently. Create it, initialize it, let it run, and leave. Walk away from your creation and let it evolve on its own. But why would anyone do that? Why would you create something this vast and complex and exquisitely detailed, and then just abandon it? Was the universe some kind of experiment left to run its natural course? A garden planted and then forgotten? Or something else entirely? Something that actually required the creator to step back and allow the system to evolve without interference? Maybe direct involvement would have contaminated the results of whatever this was meant to achieve. The team exhaustively scoured the accumulated data, searching for any indication of ongoing presence, any sign that the builder was still watching or actively influencing events in real time. They found absolutely nothing, just the mechanisms, just the code, just the self-sustaining architecture running exactly as originally designed, maintaining itself through error correction and mathematical precision. The universe wasn't waiting for its creator to return. It had been explicitly built so that such return was completely unnecessary. And that raised the most genuinely disturbing question they'd encountered yet. If the builder designed reality to run autonomously without them and then permanently left, what were humans supposed to do with that information? Were conscious beings just passive observers, watching a program execute according to predetermined parameters? Or were they something else entirely, something the builder had specifically anticipated? Because if consciousness emerging within the universe was intentional rather than accidental, if intelligent life was a predicted outcome rather than random chance, then maybe humanity wasn't the end result of this cosmic program. Maybe conscious beings capable of asking these questions and discovering these truths were actually just the next step. Maybe they were meant to inherit something. The data from Willow sat in heavily secured servers, while the research team struggled to process what they'd discovered. They'd actually answered humanity's oldest question, the one that had haunted every culture throughout history. But the answer wasn't what anyone had expected or hoped for. Not a benevolent God still watching over creation. Not random chance and meaningless accident. Something else entirely. Deliberate design without a designer remaining present to supervise what they'd created. Simulation theory had been seriously debated for years in academic and philosophical circles. Philosopher Nick Bostrom constructed a rigorous argument that if technologically advanced civilizations can create realistic simulations of consciousness, we're statistically almost certain to be living in one right now rather than base reality. Elon Musk publicly stated he thought the odds we're in the actual original universe were maybe billions to one against. This wasn't fringe speculation anymore. Serious scientists and philosophers took it seriously. Max Tegmark advanced the concept even further with his mathematical universe hypothesis. Physical reality isn't just conveniently described by mathematics. It literally is mathematics. Physical existence is mathematical structure given tangible form. If that's true, then the universe being constructed like executable code isn't some vague metaphor. It's literal reality. Even Neil deGrasse Tyson, typically skeptical of such speculations, admitted he couldn't completely dismiss the possibility. The more scientists learned about quantum mechanics and the fundamental nature of reality, the more it resembled information processing at the deepest conceivable level. Reality behaving like computation rather than computation, trying to simulate reality. What Willow had revealed fit this entire framework with disturbing precision. A universe built on pure mathematical principles, operating on sophisticated error-correcting code, explicitly designed to maintain itself without external assistance. Exactly what you'd create if you wanted a simulation to run indefinitely and develop its own emergent complexity without ongoing intervention. But here's what kept the researchers awake at night, what made them question everything. If the universe was deliberately designed and then abandoned by its creator, and consciousness subsequently emerged within it, what did that actually mean for humanity? Were people just background noise in someone else's experiment? Random outputs from automated processes that were never meant to matter? Or were conscious observers something the builder specifically anticipated? Something intentional? One researcher articulated what several others were thinking. What if the point is that the system eventually gets complex enough to produce observers who start asking questions? Who eventually figure out what they're inside of? The universe examining itself. reality becoming self-aware through minds that emerged within it. Not just observers, heirs. Humanity had spent thousands of years desperately asking who built the universe. Now they finally had an answer, and it was simultaneously enlightening and terrifying. Someone who designed a self-sustaining system capable of creating its own meaning, its own purpose, its own continuation. Someone who constructed reality with meticulous care and then deliberately walked away, leaving it to evolve naturally until it produced something capable of understanding the fundamental truth. The question wasn't who built the universe anymore. That had been answered. The question was what humanity would do now that they knew they were living inside constructed reality, and whether understanding that truth meant they just inherited responsibility for everything that came next. Whether discovering you're inside a designed system meant you were now responsible for maintaining it, improving it, or perhaps even building the next one. Willow continued running in the sealed laboratory, still generating patterns, still accessing information from dimensions and realities the team couldn't fully comprehend. And somewhere in the vast mathematical architecture of existence, woven into the error-correcting code and recursive structures, the universe itself seemed to be waiting patiently to see what its children would do with the truth they'd finally discovered. Whether they'd accept their inheritance or reject it. Whether they'd continue the work their creator had begun or forge an entirely different path. The researchers knew they couldn't keep this secret forever. Eventually, the truth would emerge and spread and change everything about how humanity understood its place in reality. And when that moment came, when everyone knew what Willow had revealed, the real test would begin. The test their creator might have been waiting billions of years to observe. The moment when consciousness finally understood the nature of its own existence and chose what to do with that knowledge. That's when humanity would discover whether they were merely observers in someone else's creation or something far more significant. Something the builder had been hoping would eventually emerge from the mathematical code they'd written at the beginning of everything.